Good morning and welcome back to Hibernate. This will be your first class for Hibernate framework, and there are several reasons of using Hibernate framework because we first started using JSF, and which we learned is a UI based framework, right? It handles all user interface related problems, right? And or we can say it's a framework based on the presentation logic. It deals in presentation logic. And second thing that we are going to start with today is another framework, which is again an open source third party framework, right? Because we know that JSF belongs to Oracle, but Hibernate is a third party framework, and it's a very famous framework, and it is used worldwide. Wherever you talk of Java, you talk of Hibernate. And hibernation, as the name suggests, it's actually sleeping to some extent, right? And waking up from a sleep, right, is what we basically know Hibernate is, right? And what are the problems that we're trying to solve using Hibernate framework? And the list of prior problems that we are going to solve is number one problem, data persistence. We have to implement data persistence using Hibernate framework. And what is the problem? Why is this required? Why is Hibernate required? So I've just made this mapping for you. Alright, so number one, Hibernate is an ORM tool. What do you call, or what do you mean by an ORM tool? ORM means object relation mapping, right? So we need to have a relationship between an object and a data persistence, or maybe we need to have a relationship between a database or a database table and Hibernate, or sorry, not a database table but an object, right? So this is the problem here that we are trying to solve. For example, we have a class known as user class, and class has member variables जिनके हम our member variables are those that we create getters and setters of. We have ID, we have name, we have address, we have contact, we have date of birth, right? And from the other side we have a database table, ID, name, address, contact, and date of birth. So we have a database table and we have an object of the class with member variables, and we need to map them, right? So that ID can go to ID, name can be mapped to name, address can be mapped to address, contact to contact, and date of birth to date of birth. And what operations can we perform after mapping? After mapping, the operations that we can perform is right, we can perform transactions like CRUD operations, means create, retrieve, update, and delete operations. All right, but we have a problem that we cannot usually we cannot use Java, or we cannot use enterprise Java directly without any framework to apply object-oriented programming in database approach. We cannot apply that, and for that what we use an object relational mapping tool. Now what is object relational mapping? We know that the class has an object, and the object has member variables, and those member variables will be mapped with attributes of the database. Now the class object is object, and the database table is known as relation. And now we need a third-party application which can do mapping between object and relation. That's why it's called as an ORM, object relational mapping tool, right? Why is Hibernate known as object relational mapping tool? Please tell me. Right, so that it can map the object of the class with the set database table, right? That's what basically it is actually for, right? Okay, let's carry on. And what can we do, and why do we need in Hibernate? We need Hibernate to map the member variables. Now we know that mapping the member variables to the database table and mapping relationship one to one, one to many, right? So we need to understand relationships as well, right? Maybe the data from a single table is going to enter more than one table, or data from a single class can enter more than one table. So that's what we have to understand. How can we map relationships? They are handling data types. We know that we have to handle data types. The data type of the user class ID can be int, and there has to be int. It has to be int in the database relationship table as well. And name can be string, and we know we don't have string in databases and tables. We have char and varchar here. So this is how it is going to not only map relationships, but it is going to handle data types as well, right? And it's going to manage the change to the object state. If the object state changes, whether the database should change as well as whether the database should change as well, right? So this is the change that Hibernate is going to manage. In nutshell, it is used in the data layer of an application. We know that we cannot use Hibernate in building or for building UI or for building a business logic. No, business logic will be as plain as simple, or we can say it will be used. Business logic will be handled by the classes or Java classes, and our data layer is going to be the DO, the data access object is going to be the plain Java object, which is POJO classes. Right, and it implements JPA. What is JPA? Java Persistence API. So Java has made something known as Java Persistence API to handle object and relation mapping, and Hibernate is actually well formed or an updated version of JPA that's used worldwide with Java for quick database mapping. So without writing queries, we just map it and just get started like a pro. So now what you got to do, so download Hibernate 5.4. You can go and download the Hibernate, and you can go to the hibernate.org and your download should start, right? Or what you can do if you're using NetBeans, right, let me close all here in NetBeans and let me start a fresh NetBeans IDE, right? Now by the time the NetBeans starts, it should not take time. So I'll again tell you that we have a class, we have a table. To map them using object-oriented methodology without writing insert into or select from database queries. Without writing select and insert queries, we just map the object, and this is how we can do that. So we'll go ahead, I'll say new projects, I'll go with new projects. So I'll say Java Web, I'll go with web application, and I'll call this as web application Hibernate class. So I call this my Hibernate class, or I'll call this as Hibernate class. So the project name is now Hibernate class. I'll say next, and the server that I'll be using is Glassfish. It's recommended that you use Apache Tomcat. And I'll go ahead and choose the framework right here. So we still have 4.3.1. We can use the same as well. Right, so Hibernate 3.4.3.1 is something that we are going to use, and this is not going to be set here. So we are going to learn how to set database connection in a different way. So that's it. I'll say finish. After selecting the framework, just click on finish. So it is going to connect to the database. So the database is ready. All right, so this is something that you have to work on. Hibernate.cfg. What is CFG? It's short of configuration, and .xml is the extension. Hibernate configuration file, and the format of the file is XML. Right, and if you go to your project, so let me close down this my first JSF. So this is the project my Hibernate class. As you can see, it has an index.html page, but in the default package, in the source package, default package, we have hibernate.cfg.html, XML, and you can see it has two versions, right? You can view, we can say the source code as well of the file. So now if I close down this file, and let me open the file right here, and then you can see we have something known as a SessionFactory, and we have something known as security. So we will deal with both SessionFactory and security. All right, so we don't mind dealing with both of them, right? And if I just carry on, okay, now you can see you have to arrange some properties right here, but wait a second right here. So I will open this file. Okay, let me, okay. So let me view Windows. So I will say tools, window, projects is already there, files should be there, output is already there, editor should already be there, and IDE tools are there, web is there, debugging is there, navigator is there, Maven runner is not required, so I'll change the browser here. So I'll go with the Chrome, and let us start the project first to check whether we have any error or not. Alright, so project is about to start. I'll go right click and edit. Okay, I'll pause the video by the time Hibernate starts. Alright, the test is successful and now we are just running this class right here. And what I got to do is just edit some properties right here. Alright, and what you can do is click here, right, and right click here. You can go and right click here. You can see this hibernate.cfg.xml. Right click here, go to editors and go to source, and now you'll be able to view the source code of this file. So we don't need this documentation, so I would rather be happy deleting all the documentation. Now you can clearly see that all what we have to deal in is the Hibernate configuration. Now you have to remember this forever, that we have Hibernate configuration, and let us go and write down these important types. So we can say Hibernate configuration. Okay. So we have this Hibernate configuration, right? And you have to remember this forever, right? It works on tags. So number one, we have to deal with Hibernate configuration tag, right? And after that we have SessionFactory. You'll not be able to understand it, right? But you have to understand it. Let's not write tags here. Let's just write simple Angrezi, right? Simple English. So SessionFactory, right? And then we have properties. Number 3 we have. So 3 things that we are going to deal with. One is the SessionFactory, right? Another is the session itself, right? And or we can say the properties of the session. So let me tell you how do we work with this, or how do we actually go and have a database get connected to our MySQL database that we have already made. So I have this PHP myadmin. So I'll go to PHP myadmin if it's running. If it's not running, so I'll run my tool, XAMPP. Alright, so MySQL should be running if your MySQL database is running. In case if it's not running, you can install XAMPP, alright, and start the services Apache and MySQL. So now MySQL is running here. So I'll go and create a new database. So I'll say create database Hibernate Test. So now we know the database name is Hibernate Test. I'll say go ahead and create the database. And now we are entering Hibernate Test. It has no tables at all. We have just been able to create Hibernate database. So now let's get connected with MySQL first, right? There are 2 ways. You can right click here and go to the design source and go and get connected here. So you will say that I want to get connected here. So I'll edit the driver class right here. So the driver is going to be MySQL JDBC driver. So I'll just click here com.mysql.jdbc.driver, and for that the second thing that I'll do in my libraries, I'll see whether this is MySQL. So no, MySQL is not there. I will go and I'll say let's first do it without adding a library, and then we'll see whether it's required to add a library. Okay, com.mysql.jdbc.driver. The second thing, what is the URL, right? So I'll have to edit this as well. I'll say that the URL for the MySQL is going to be the following. So it is going to be including the database name. So we'll have to understand 2 different things right here. Okay, what is the database name? What are the database credentials that we have to write down? Okay, and what is the dialect, and every single thing that is actually required in getting connected, okay, to the database. And this is going to be once for all. You are going to make this file once for all. It's not like that you are making this file every now and again. No, You go and make this file and you make it once for all, right? And use the same file every time you need to get connected to the database. In that case, if you don't know what is basically the connection, you can go again right here, or even if you don't want to go to source code, you can say JDBC, right? You can say MySQL, right? And it works on port that is 3306, and the database name is that we just made, Hibernate Test. So this is the database name. So I'll just write it down here, Hibernate Test. Right? What is the username? You know, the by default username is the root, and we do not have any password. So I will not write anything in the password, right? So because I don't have any password, but it is not going to allow you edit here. You'll have to go back to editor source. Now once we go to source, you can see that it has chosen the dialect. I'll tell you what the dialect does. Org Hibernate dialect and com.mysql.jdbc driver has been chosen, and 3306 MySQL localhost 3306. Hibernate Test is actually the name of the database, and we do not have password, so I'm not going to set the password property, right? By not setting the password property, what you are actually doing is, because your database has no password, but if you set the database password, you'll have to use it as well. So we'll keep it as it is. The second thing, we are going to make a DAO, which is known as database access object or data access object. So I'll go ahead and make a new Java class, and I will save it inside the package persistence, and I'll name this class users, right? So now we have a class users, right? And it is here, right? And the class has some properties known as private int, let's say user ID, or we can say private int ID, so it will suffice. And we have private string, let's say about first name as an F name, private string L name as a last name, so I'll say private string username, all right, and private string password. So I'll just use these string values. After that we can upgrade it. Now the first rule is first, in order to use the table as an entity for database relationship mappings, you have to mark this as an entity, right? Annotation entity, you can see imported from javax.persistence.entity, right? So you have to mark this as an entity. The moment you mark this as an entity means that this is something which is actually data persistent. This is something that is actually going to be mapped to the database, right? And after you made an entity, there is one rule, that the entity should have at least one primary key, right? And how do you make it as a primary key? ID attribute. I'll say this is an ID attribute, so I'll use javax.persistence, right, and mark this as an ID, right? So this is the key attribute. Now this is going to be the key attribute of the database, and every database that you are making, right, you know, that has a column that uniquely identifies the entire row, and that is actually an ID column. That's why we are mentioning this as an ID column in order to get started with the persistence, and everything else we don't have to do anything, right? And now imagine what we have to do, right, in order to access, right? I'll just print screen this. All right, now you can see right here, right, and now this is the model and entity class. Entity as a database mapping. This is something that's going to be mapped to the database, okay? Right, and in order to do so, you have to access the database. And now first what will I do here is the following things. So I want to change certain things here, but yeah, wait a second, I want to do certain changes as well, and for that I'll go with a new Java class in the default package, and I call this as maybe register. Okay, I call this as register, and I'll make it as a servlet. So I'll say extends. How do you make a servlet? By extending it from HTTP servlet. The moment you extend the class from HTTP servlet, it becomes a servlet, right, by overriding two property or by overriding two methods of the HTTP servlet, which is protected void do get. It takes two parameters, HTTP servlet req. So it takes two parameters, HTTP servlet request as request, and the type is HTTP servlet resp response servlet. So I have HTTP servlet response as response. So now we're overriding these two functions right here. Okay, HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. So now you can clearly see the marking here because you have to override them. Why are we overriding them? Override means we're redefining the do get function which is already defined in HTTP servlet. Alright, there are two methods that we have to override, HTTP get and post, but by this time we'll only use get. And let me create another function right here, private, let's say private void HTML. So I call this function as HTML, and I'll make sure that the function accepts the same parameters as well. And I can say print, you know the basics of Java or servlets, you have understood servlets, right? That's why you are here, because you have understood servlets, you understood JSP. That's why now you're here, and you're here to learn Hibernate. So I can say print writer. I'll create an object of print writer out is equal to response, because print writer is associated with the response object of the servlet, right? So response dot get print writer out is equal to, let me just import it first, is equal to response dot get writer. Right, so now we're getting writer, and now the moment you start dealing with IO, it throws an exception. You'll have to throw one exception. I'll say it throws IO exception, and the second exception it throws is servlet. It throws is servlet, servlet exception, right? Okay, now we have done print writer out, so I can now go ahead and say out dot print hello. So now let's test this hello first. I'll go online and test this hello, and now you can clearly see we're not getting anything at all because we'll have to fire the servlet first of all. And in order to use the servlet, I will use the annotation. I'll say @ of web servlet, @ web servlet. So I will use URL patterns is equal to, right, so I will say test. So whenever I write test, so I'm going to execute this servlet right here. You can do the same in the deployment descriptor. As you know Java, you can do the same in the deployment descriptor. What is the deployment descriptor? It is actually the file which is web.xml file is also known as your deployment descriptor, and you know that. I don't have to teach you those things. You've already understood those things. So let me go ahead and execute Hibernate class /test, and you can clearly see that we have executed test. So print writer out equal to response dot get writer out dot println, and now you know that when you load the website for the first time, which method is called, get or post? No, by default when you load the web application for the first time, it's only get that's called. So I can say print, because get is called, we're not calling this function HTML here, so I will call this function, I'll say this dot HTML, and I'll pass the HTTP request and the response. And because now get is also going to use the IO stream, so I will throw, so I can say throws IO exception and servlet exception here as well. So we're done now. Our servlet is absolutely ready, and we are getting a hello. All right, and if I write hello like this h1, right, so if I write it like this, right, so we are getting big hello. Okay, so fine, so everything is working fine. But yeah, I will set it like this, response dot set header, or we can say response dot set, or can say, okay, I can use response.set header. Okay, let's not set the header here because we have to use Hibernate, so it's not. It's very simple here. Okay, now we are done. Hello is printed and we are almost done, right? We need to print hello from Hibernate. So I'll print hello from Hibernate and we are getting hello from Hibernate. Now let's implement the JPA, which is the Java, let's implement the class that we have just made, right? And we have to create getters and setters there. So I'll go to users.java, right? It's been marked as an entity and it has an ID attribute as well. I'll go downstairs and I'll say insert code, getters and setters of all. So now my getters and setters are also ready. So now what I do, I'll have to call users here in the register.java. So I'll go ahead and create an object of users, right? So I'll say user user is equivalent to new users. After creating an object, you can set user.set id. It is going to be 1 and I can say user.set fname. So I'll set it mine. So I'll say fhim and I can say user.set lname and I'll mention khan, right? And I'll mention user.set username. So I will set my username as an IIT and I can say user.set password and I'll set the password as PASSWRD. Instead of set, we have called get, and now we know that object is filled, right? So now what we have to do is map the object user. I have to send only this object user because the object user is everything now. The object user has ID, fname, lname, username and password, and this is what we have to do. We have to map this object with the database, and it's as simple as anything, right? We don't have to deal with some higher logic here, but it's a basic logic that we are going to do and that we are going to deal with. And remember, what we have to do is call Hibernate configuration. Number one thing that we are going to do is call the Hibernate configuration. But yeah, if you go ahead and see what is inside Hibernate configuration, there is a SessionFactory. So we're going to take help from SessionFactory. We'll say, hey SessionFactory, give me an object of database connection, which is hibernate.cfg.xml. We'll call this SessionFactory, and this SessionFactory actually has everything. The dialect. What do you basically what does dialect do? Well, dialect is basically, that we write program here, right? And this program is written in plain Java code. You can see it's Java code. It's plain old Java object here, right? But marked as an entity, and here we are writing plain Java code. And now we need someone who can convert Java written code. So we can say someone who can convert Java written code to the DB understandable query, right? So now who is going to be that someone who can convert Java written code into the DB understandable format, and what language does your DB understand? Because Oracle understands something else, Oracle 11g, or you can say SQL Server understands something else, and MySQL understands something. Well, that is why giving a proper dialect here is very important. Dialect is actually the query or the language that will be, or we can say is it will be the conversion of Java written code to the desired database language code. And in our case, we are using the driver to take the connection through, right, is MySQL JDBC driver. But how do you convert the query? Because you can use either MySQL, you can use SQL Server, you can either use Oracle, NoSQL, or you can use SQLite. There are many databases, and every database has its own dialect. In order to edit the dialect, let me go to editors and design, and you can clearly see right here data source properties. We don't have anything. Driver class is here and driver is here, right? And we can see class caching, no collection caching, nothing, optional configuration. Now you can see that we have this dialect here. We can go and edit the dialect, and we can say what dialect do we have here, right? So we have org.hibernate.dialect.mysql dialect. So I'll change it to MySQL dialect in the configuration properties, or you can directly go to the editors and go to the source code, and you can clearly see that you have changed the dialect to org.hibernate.dialect.mysql dialect, and the driver uses com.mysql.jdbc driver, and you are going to connect to 3306 port, and which is the basic port of MySQL, and the database name is Hibernate Test. While logging into this database, it requires only the default username and it does not require any password at all. Now we are done here. But yeah, wait a second. I want to show how my dialect is being converted. I want to see how the dialect is being converted, right? So how do you see that? Let's see this. I will use a property. So I'll go with property and say property name is equivalent to, and I call this as show underscore SQL. Do you want to see how and what dialect your Java written code is going to get converted to before it's sent to the database? I'll say yes, show me the SQL is going to get converted to, right? And by default show SQL is false, and I'll turn it to true. So now show SQL is completely true, right? And now what do you want? Do you have the table? No, we don't have the table. If you go ahead and literally check your database, Hibernate Test has no table defined here. We have not made any table as of now, right? Isn't it? No, we have not made. So I'll say I want, if the table does not exist, if I apply the database approach or database model first approach, right? So the table should be automatically created. In order to create the table automatically, we use a property, right? And I call this property as HBM2DLL, right? So I repeat, HBM, right, to DLL dot auto. By default it is set to update, and I will change it to create. So this means show me the SQL. If you go to the output window, it will show you right here. It is going to show you how your database or how your Java written code is converted to the database query using the correct dialect, and the dialect is MySQL dialect. Dialect means it is going to be converted to like this, insert into database values and something like that, right? And we do not have the table, so that's why we are going to create. So it is not code, it is AUT auto, right? We call this as auto. Do you want to create it? Yes, say yeah. Table does not exist, so go and create the table. Once the table is created, I'll show you how to update it as well, right? And now what class do you want to map? I'll say, hey, wait a second, my mapping is going to happen with the class which is inside persistence, maybe, yeah. It is going to be PERSISTANCE, persistence. Now you can clearly see it is inside persistence package, and the class name is user, USER user. So I'll say persistence dot user. So I'll just close it down. Now this is my mapping class, right? And this is how it is going to treat, right? Is it going to create the table if the table does not exist? In our case, table doesn't exist. Either I go and manually create a table inside the database. If I'm not going to manually create a database inside, if I don't go and manually create a database table, I need Hibernate to automatically create the table in order if in case if the table does not exist. And do you want to see the SQL? Yes. How do you want to see the SQL? How do you want your Java written code to be converted to SQL? Using the MySQL dialect. How do you get connected to the database? By using JDBC MySQL driver. And where do you get connected? On 3306. Which database do you get connected? The database name is Hibernate Test. What are the credentials of database? Root is the username, but we haven't set any password yet. And now we are done. Call the SessionFactory object and run the transaction. Now I'll go, because now my object is ready. Right here we can say everything is set and done. Sorry. Now what I have to do is go and fire it. Right. I'll call SessionFactory. So I'll simply go and I say, hey, session FAC. So I'll call the SessionFactory. org.hibernate is the package that we will use. in calling the session factory, and I'll make an object of session factory. I will say session factory is equal to, where do you get the connection from? Session factory is good, right? But it is going to be called within the Hibernate configuration. So configuration dot create session factory. I repeat, Hibernate configuration, which is configuration dot session factory. So I will say is equal to, I'll make a new instance of it. So I'll say new configuration. So I'll just Java X security, no, not security configuration. So we have to import the proper configuration file. So is equal to new configuration, and C has to be capital right here. Alright, so let me go ahead and see what configuration that I use. I'll have to use Hibernate right here, org.hibernate, right? So it is basically configuration exception, so I don't have to import configuration exception. So I'll say is equal to new configuration. So I'll just click here. I will go and import org.hibernate.cfg.configuration. I repeat, org.hibernate.cfg.configuration. And now I will say configuration.build the session factory. Go and configure. So I'll say configuration.configure.build session factory. All right, so we are going to build session factory, and yeah, we know that this basically is depleted, or we can say this is obsolete. So but we are still going to use the same, and then we are going to get converted to the application context. But yeah, now you're called session factory with the help of configuration. It means you are going to get everything that's available here. Configuration.build the session factory, and now your database connection is absolutely ready to get formed, right? And now what are you going to do here? I say do the following things. Now then session factory is ready. What you got to do is open the session. So I will just call session, right? And it is going to be the Hibernate session. All right, so I will session session. So I'll import org.hibernate.session is equivalent to new. I'll use the session factory object, session factory dot open session. Now your session with the database is open, completely open. You opened your connection. Now what do you want to do? What do you want to deal with? Right, so I want to do transaction. So I'll say session dot begin transaction. After that, I do is session. What do you want to save? I'll say I want to save something. So what is that something? And that's an object I want to save, user. Go and save the complete object user. Now you can clearly see user has every single thing, and now we know that the user class is defined as an entity, right? And it has an ID attribute. Every entity should have an ID attribute. Now what do? Fill the object up, create the object of session factory, open the session, begin the transaction, save the user, session dot, or now commit, or we can say commit the transaction. So I can say session dot get transaction dot commit. So you're committing the transaction, and that's it. Right, that's it. What you have to do. You don't have to write insert into database or something like that, right? And now let's see this. It's downloading something. So by the time it downloads, I will save it, and we have an error right here. Unable to load class com.mysql.jdbc.driver. As I said, you have to add this library right here. I'll go to library, I'll say add a library, and I'll search for MySQL JDBC driver. So I've added MySQL JDBC driver. I will save it and run it again. Alright, so it's running. Wait. Could not execute statement. We have org.hibernate exception, SQL grammar exception. Now what is the grammar exception? We'll have to see that. Okay, let me clear this exception. Carry on, see the exception. Now we are getting an exception right here. We'll have to read this exception. Okay, table Hibernate Test dot users does not exist. Now, but we have written that you need to create it. Maybe we have written something wrong here. Maybe HBM2DLL is the file that we have to use, I suppose, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, this is the same file that we use, HBM2.dll. Let me write it down again. HBM2DLL.auto is set to create, but why isn't it working? Okay, let me see. This property name is equivalent to. So let me search. Maybe I'm writing something wrong. HBM2DLL auto. So this is the property HBM2DLL, and I suppose it should work because I have kept it as create. That means it should create, right? And I've written that create the table if it does not exist, so it should work. I don't know. Yeah, now it has worked, right? And now if I go to the table, I hit enter and go and test the table. This is the Hibernate test, and you find a table has been automatically created right here. If I go inside the table and table has a data ID 1, Fahim, Khan, password. Now if I change it, now let's say about if I change, I want to register another user right here. I'll go to my servlet and I say, for example, I want to register, right, someone else, right? So I can say I want to register Imran, right, but, and his username is IMRAN and password is password. Now if I save it and if I rerun it, right, so let me wait whether it gets compiled, and now it's done. Could not execute the statement, constant violation exception. So let me see. Imran but set ID 1 and password is password. Let me go to the database and see what it actually has done. Alright, it has actually broken down the database. Now you can see a database has violated all the things. Alright, because you're not closing down the connection. After you say commit, right, once you have committed on the database, you have to close the session because the session is yet open. Now you can clearly see here in the register class, if I say that after committing, I'll say session dot, right, so now you have to close it as well. The session, if you're opening the session after committing the transaction, you have to close down the session as well. So if you're not closing down the session, it is going to create a problem. Now then you have closed down the session, you created a new session. If I go to table users, and now you can say it has created a new table, Imran but password and something like that. Now if I go and re-edit it once again in the register table, so I'll say, okay, I need second user to be inserted, which is Fahim, KHAN Khan, and the username is FHAN KHAN and the password is password. Now if I redo this, and let's see what happens after I reinsert data into the database. Now if I go and now you can see that it has, instead of creating a new table, instead of creating a new record, it has created a new table, right, and it has overwritten the table. So for that, once the table is ready, you go to your Hibernatecfg.xml, HBM2DLL.auto is already there, and instead of create, now say update. Now we'll not create a new table but update the current table. Now if I go and say IMRAN Imran Khan and IMRAN Imran, and now you will say instead of creating, it is going to get updated, right? So we still have an exception right here in SQL. Okay. Now what is happening right here is actually we are trying to close the session. If there is an error in the transaction, session will not be closed. So what are we going to do here? In order to use it in a proper way, we will use try, right, and we will use till commit, we will use try, and I can use catch, right, Hibernate exception E, right, and I will use the third thing, which is finally, right, and I can use finally. What you got to do is close the session. So now what finally does, whether the exception occurs or the exception does not occur. So I'll just keep this session here, All right. So it doesn't matter whether the exception occurs or not. We are opening the session outside this try block, right? So we're opening the session right here, right? And if there is no exception, save the user, commit the transaction, and close the session. Even if there is an exception, still close the session. So now this is something that is going to work absolutely fine. And if there is an exception, what do you want to do? I will say session.get transaction.rollback. Roll back the transaction in case any error occurs. Don't update the table, right? Roll it back. Now, if I now run it once again, right, now it is done. Now you can see it's perfect example now. I'll go to users and see that the table has been created with Fahim Khan password and something like that. And now if I write new data, Imran Khan, Imran and password, and now if I run it, it should update the table. Instead of inserting a new record, it should try and update the current table. So session.begin transaction, session.save, session.get transaction.commit, and let's say out.print data inserted. So we'll say data inserted successfully, and in case if there is an exception, so we will say out.println e.get message. We can say e.get message and see what is happening now. Could not execute statement. So this is the exception that's been caught. You clearly see the exception has been caught, and the exception is could not execute the statement. So there is some kind of error in this statement. So if I go and say create, create a new table, all right, and let's see what happens now. Okay, data inserted successfully. So now you can clearly see that the data has been inserted successfully, Imran Khan. And now I'll say update. All right, and now instead of this, I will also, I have to set ID as well. I'll say to Fahim Khan and FAHIMKHAN. Now because we have set it to update, this is going to update the table instead of recreating the table. It should rather update the table. Now let's see what it does. Data inserted successfully. I go and check the database table, and I find the second row has been successfully inserted, right? Just by keeping it update, now it's going to update the table without recreating it, right? So it's always good that if you don't want to go to the database and create table, you want your object to be mapped with the table automatically. So this is how we do, and Hibernate is going to be a real fun working with, inshallah. Stay in touch, watch all the series lectures. Inshallah, we'll be completing all Hibernate, and the next module is going to be more interesting. The next class is going to be double interesting as well. So I wish you all the best. Do watch the lecture, do practice, and don't let it on tomorrow. If you do, today's lecture should be finished today. Practice it today so that you get a different lecture tomorrow and you practice a different lecture tomorrow. I wish you all the best and see you. Bye bye. Take care.